I am Jim Bishop, Director of Catholic Charities Legal Network here at the Archdiocese of Washington. I am a 26-year employee, and I am also a member of Catholic Charities Spirituality Committee. Father John asked me, our president, to get in contact with retired Judge Arthur Burnett, who is a retired judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. I hope that you will take a few minutes to look at the film that Judge Burnett has done on his life and his 57 years of professional experience. Judge Burnett is an African American retired judge, the first magistrate, U.S. magistrate in the country, person of color, and he is also has been um, has been a judge in the Superior Court for many years. I hope that you will enjoy this film on his life. And I think seeing this film now is especially poignant as we're in the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're dealing with the issue of race throughout our country. Because Judge Burnett, I think, is a wonderful role model for all persons of color, and actually all persons. He has come from a segregated town in Virginia, growing up, segregated by law, and he's gone all the way to, in his professional career, to being in the halls of with national leaders, working side by side with them, as well as state and local leaders. Judge Burnett and his wife are proud parents and grandparents, and they also are parishioners at one of our local parishes in the Archdiocese, Blessed Sacrament of the Archdiocese of Washington, the Most Blessed Sacrament. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoy this film. And thanks to Judge Burnett and his family.
Hello, I'm Paula Gwynn-Grant. It is an honor to be with you. I serve as Secretary of Communications for the Catholic Archdiocese of Washington. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you a wonderful American who has served this nation and all of us for many, many years, the Honorable Arthur Burnett Sr. He's a graduate of Howard University here in Washington, D.C., and also NYU, New York University's School of Law. It was 1958 that he graduated and stepped into true leadership roles from the very start. He has lived an incredible life of service and dedication to our nation, breaking down walls and really demonstrating true leadership. From his early days with the U.S. Department of Justice to his days in 1961, as he briefed the Attorney General regularly about any significant law enforcement or criminal law aspects connected to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Arthur Burnett Sr., he's enjoyed a 57-year professional career. A senior judge on the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, he was the first appointed African-American magistrate in the United States. Today, this Catholic leader is also National Executive Director of the National African American Drug Policy Coalition, where they're promoting health and justice. And today, he is going to speak to all of us. So let's listen now to Judge Burnett as he talks to us about his vision for America. Please welcome the Honorable Arthur Burnett Sr.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of America and youth of America. I come before you this morning to talk to you about one of the most vital issues facing this nation today and facing this nation in its very history. I'm indeed fortunate to be standing here today because in July of 1952, I could have been shot and killed by two Fredericksburg City police officers who thought I was a burglar at a Howard Johnson restaurant where I was employed and had been left to clean it up and serve as a kind of night manager. And my father's second vehicle was in the shop, and I had to wait for him to pick me up. The officers drove out, and within 5 or 6 feet of me, jumped out of their cars, squat position, guns pointed at me. I said, "Officers, what's the problem? I work here." They said, "Yeah, we bet you do." I say, "Sir, I'm the busboy. Mr. Overton left me here to finish cleaning up and locking the place up while I wait for my father. Oh, here he comes now." They made him stay in his car, but some 60 or 70 feet away, and put me in the back of their car and locked the doors. They didn't put me in handcuffs. Fortunately, they took me to Mr. Overton's home. Mr. Overton vouched for me and said, "Yes, he's the best employee I've ever had. I wish he wasn't going away to college this fall. But if I had been belligerent, had I been arrogant, or had I made any quick moves, my body could have been riddled with bullets that night." I tell that story when I talk to youngsters in D.C. and across the country about young black boys who are defiant, who are belligerent when confronted or even approached by police officers on the one hand, and police officers who approach them with attitudes that they are up to no good, who are in fact assuming and looking for reasons to stop and frisk and pat them down, to find some excuse to arrest them. Indeed, I once, as a judge, had a case before me where a young man, 17 years of age, was so hostile and belligerent that he was charged with assault on a police officer and was brought to trial before me as a juvenile court judge. And at the end of the prosecution's case, I had a doubt as to whether the event happened, as the officer said it happened. And it so happened that the defense lawyer got smart enough to put him on the witness stand, and he on the witness stand said, "I knew the officer was going to hassle me, so I struck him first." I put him on probation, but he was so arrogant that 6 months later, in a fight with the youth group, he was killed. When I read only in the newspaper a couple of days ago about the events in Chicago, about the looting, the burning, the breaking of windows of buildings by young teenage boys in so-called protest movements, I said they don't realize that they are harming our zeal, our effort to achieve equality for America. Our protest leaders must, in fact, discourage youngsters from being violent during protest movements and give people an excuse to say, that's why we don't want to give them full equality and equal justice and to eliminate white supremacy in America, where everybody is equal. I come to you because that's on the front lines of the newspapers today and on our computers. But let me go back and talk about my mission, my zeal in life, because my mother, who only had an 8th grade education, when I was 3, 4 years of age, taught me to read from Jack and Jill and Spot, little kindergarten type books before I went to school. And for some reason, I had a zeal to want to read everything I could put my hands on. And then when I went to school in 1941, Mrs. Eleanor Lewis said, "You like to read and like to explain what you read? I want you to be my helper or assistant." And I became her assistant teacher. And she was teacher for the 1st to the 3rd grade section, in a 2-room house with no running school, with no water, no cafeteria, where we cooked vegetables brought from farms in segregated America. But she said, Arthur, you got a brilliant mind. You're going to amount to somebody. You're going to be the first lawyer from Spotsylvania, Virginia. When I got to high school, my high school professor said being a Negro or colored lawyer is a pipe dream. You get a law degree, but you hang it on a wall where you had food to eat, where you even be able to drive taxi cabs or be a butler. But colored people don't have money, and white people are not going to hire you. What's the use of having a law degree? And in the meantime, I was active in a Baptist church, teaching in Sunday schools, teaching about Jesus Christ. And my high school teacher said, well, why don't you go to Tuskegee, become a farm expert, agricultural expert, and then go to Virginia Union University Theology School and become a preacher. Because since 12, 13 years of age, you've been a youth minister. And you've been talking about what we should do with all people and treating people with equality, and as Jesus taught us on earth. And as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, to let it be done here on earth as it's done in heaven. But with discrimination and violence and crimes, we don't achieve that. And let us remember that Jesus Christ, when he was only 12 years of age, disappeared from the personal sight and custody of Mary and Joseph. And they went looking for him, and they found him in the synagogue. And he said, I must be about my Father's work. So during high school, I told Mr. Scott, my principal, and others, that I just don't want to teach and talk to people about what they need to do to get into heaven. I want to bring a little bit of heaven to earth. I want to have people recognized for who they are as individuals. And I persisted not in going to Tuskegee. Indeed, Mr. Regland, my agriculture instructor, came to my home one evening at 6 o'clock and talked to my father and mother until midnight, trying to persuade them to force me to go to Tuskegee to become a farm expert, to teach black farmers how to farm and raise the best crops and animals. And they said, well, no, he's always dreamed of becoming a lawyer. We're not going to interfere now. And at 17 years of age, I went off to Howard as a little country boy who had never lived in a place where there was running water or bathroom. My first experience to indoor toiletry was at Howard University in Cook Hall. But I excelled, and I made straight A's. And I said, I will show them. Little did I know that my showing them would again put me in death's ways, because on a famous day in the history of this country, the U.S. Supreme Court came down with a decision in Brown versus Board of Education about equality in education, about abolishing segregation. And in October of '54, I was called to Mr. James Neighbor's office. He was the vice president of Howard and had been the chief lawyer in Shop v. Bolin, which was one of the 5 cases consolidated with the Brown case, which was the lead case. And I thought Dr. Draper had called me there to talk about school activities, and I was active president, chairman of various committees. And he said, Arthur, we called you here to talk to you about your personal circumstances. And he said, you were the best student we have here at Howard. We want you from Virginia to apply to go to law school in your junior year when the combination program in Virginia to break the back to massive resistance to desegregation. But it might mean you will face being kidnapped and lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. And then he said, by the way, that gentleman sitting over next to the wall about 6, 8 feet away, that's Thurgood Marshall. And he will be your lawyer. We will protect you. NACP will protect you. Being 18, 19 years of age, I didn't think I had to ask my parents. And I agreed. When I went home in November, I told my parents. My mother prayed the 23rd Psalm. Yeah, you walk through the valley, shadow of death, you should fear no evil. The Lord will be with you. And my dad said, I may lose my job, but God gave you a gift. And we will run those risks. I don't know how I did it, but I went back to Howard and slept peacefully. I don't recall having one night that I couldn't sleep. Reconciled to my fate, and I became the lead plaintiff in the Virginia Farmville Prince Edward School cases and lived under threats of being kidnapped and lynched for 6 months. And I may be here today talking to you because of Governor Orwell Forbes, because it had not been for Forbes, I would have been in the role in Virginia that James Meredith played in Mississippi, with marshals with me as bodyguards to keep me alive in Virginia in the fall of 1955. But because of Forbes, the NACP and Marshall decided they had to concentrate on that case, and they settled my case, and Virginia agreed to pay all my expenses and send me to law school up north. My first choice had been Columbia. This is where Thurgood wanted me to go. But 3 or 4 weeks after the settlement agreement had been worked out, and there was wiggle room in the settlement agreement to Columbia or any other university, NYU made me an offer of a full faculty scholarship, in addition to Virginia for paying all of my expenses. So I ended up going to NYU Law School with 2 full scholarships and ended up being the only person of color in my class. Needless to say, God gave me the insight, the drive, the wisdom to excel at the end of my second year at NYU. Out of over 250 law students, and only about 2 or 3 of us being Negroes, I ended up number 11 in my class and was encouraged by my white Jewish friends who treated me like I'd come here from outer space to apply to the Attorney General Honors Program. And I applied primarily just to go along with their thoughts at the time. And lo and behold, Larry Walsh, the Deputy Attorney General, came to NYU fall of 2017, recommended me for the Attorney General's Honors Program in the Justice Department. And I ended up at the Justice Department in June of 1958 after graduating from NYU in the top 10% of my law school class. I got drafted in the Army, and I'll skip over that, but there God was with me too, because I had been trying to get an Air Force commission as a lawyer, but my local draft board drafted me in the Army as a buck private, as if I were just a high school graduate. I ended up in Army Personnel Administration in a brigade headquarters in California, and in April of '59, I was put on orders to go to Korea, to the Korean Advisory Mission, to replace a guy killed in sniper fire the week before. 2 or 3 days later, those orders were canceled. Mysteriously, I don't know how. But I stayed in California and became an Army officer in the Adjutant General Corps instead. But had I gone to Korea, I may not be here today. But again, God interceded. And then I ended up at the Justice Department after 2 years active duty, and the second day, Robert Kennedy was on duty. He called for me, and he said, at that point there were only three, no, I was the fourth, Negro lawyers in the Department of Justice in January 1961. And he said, Arthur, you had the most brilliant record of any Negro I've ever met. I want you to be my personal assistant. But more than that, I want you to be my undercover agent to monitor the FBI, to make sure the FBI does not engage in unlawful practices in monitoring the Martin Luther King movement, the Civil Rights Movement, to make sure the Communist Party does not infiltrate it, because we were just recovering from the McCarthy era. I was instructed at that time that I could not even tell my wife what I was working on. I could only talk to Bobby Kennedy, to Wizard White, who was then Deputy Attorney General before being appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and to the President himself. Other than that, I was not to tell people my sacred role. And indeed, even today, I cannot go into anything that's not public. I'm still embargoed, according to Eric Holder and then President Barack, from mentioning anything that is classified. But for 61 till Bobby left to run for the Senate, I was the hidden undercover agent, matter of fact, pretending to be his butler so that even the white senior lawyers wouldn't pump me for information. And in many instances, when I walked down the halls of justice, senior white lawyers would say, hey boy, come here a minute, can you take this? I said, sir, I'm a lawyer just like you. Call for a messenger. Then I was mistaken to be a messenger because Negro lawyers didn't exist in the Department of Justice in that number back in the 60s. And I would say today, if anyone wants to vouch for me, all you need to do is talk with Ethel Kennedy. Indeed, during those Kennedy era, I frequently was in the office on weekends, walking Brumus, the big black dog, with Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, with other children, and with Bill Foley, the father of our pastor here at Blessed Sacrament. And I knew Priest Foley when he was a kid, 12, 13, 14 years of age. And when Bobby left to go to the Senate and run, I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. But that was not the end of my deep involvement with the Civil Rights Movement, because in '68, Martin was assassinated. We had riots and burnings and lootings in the District of Columbia, never had before, never had since. And I was recruited to become the first legal counsel of the Metropolitan Police Department to make sure the police department and its officers did not engage in police brutality, in civil rights violations. And I went to that office, and that's when I moved back into D.C., and in December of '68 became a member of this parish and became active in the church in just about every role except become a deacon since 1968 to the present time. At the legal department, at the Metropolitan Police Department, I sat in the office next door to the chief of police and I wrote his testimony that he gave to Congress. I wrote the general orders. And indeed, the chief indicated that anytime any law enforcement officers had a legal issue in a homicide or a rape case or so, come see our legal counsel to make sure you do it right and don't violate civil rights issues. He is a past Justice Department attorney, and we want to make sure the Metropolitan Police Department complies with the procedures required by the U.S. Supreme Court. I had planned to be there 3 to 5 years, but then I get a call to apply to become one of the United States magistrates created an act of Congress of December of '68. Matter of fact, I wasn't even aware at the time I got the call the system even existed. But they say, with the change in times, we want one to go to an African American or a person of color. I'm not sure which terms they used. And you're the best qualified lawyer we've seen in 20 years or more. We want you to apply, and I became the first African American United States magistrate, now called magistrate judges, in the history of the United States. And lo and behold, in that role, I became an assistant to a gentleman named John Sirica, who was the chief judge in handling pretrial matters involving Watergate and the Nixon issue. And I was the one that persuaded Sirica to compel Nixon to produce the missing tape. I had a role in the pretrial proceedings and that case, much like the impeachment cases involving Trump, although we had a different type of Senate at that time. And Nixon, rather than go to trial, did the graceful day and resigned, and Gerald Ford became president. I think that's enough about my history at this point. In the magistrate system, I became the chair of the Education Committee to improve the system to a point of eliminating the need for deficient search and arrest warrants. That in the Fourth Amendment area, that warrants and applications approved by magistrates across the country would meet constitutional standards, and the district court and court of appeals would not have to. And I ended up being liaison to the Judicial Council, the Judicial Center, and to Tom Clark, who had resigned. Thurgood was appointed to his position to become head of the Federal Judicial Center. And I developed the standards for arrest and search warrants, where search warrants for houses in the hood would have to meet the same standard as for houses that were mansions. And I became the professor at the National Judicial College and lectured to state judges for 10 years, improving the quality of the magistrate system. And then, after 6 years, I was persuaded to leave the magistrate system and become the legal counsel for the entire U.S. government in the civil service system, the legal advisor, with a salary increase of about $25,000 a year, and kids getting ready to go to college, and being persuaded that I could come back to the judiciary later, I resigned as magistrate and became the legal counsel to the Civil Service Commission. And then things evolved there, where I ended up becoming the special assistant to Jimmy Carter in revising the civil service system. I'm the chief author of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 that ended up creating and embellishing the powers of OPM, the Merit System Protection Board, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the Office of Special Counsel. I'm, you might say, the quarterback that put together that act and wrote most of it. And also the government reorganization plans that led to taking education out of HEW and creating a separate U.S. Department of Education. I tell you all that not to brag about my future, but to let American youth know that you can rise from poverty if you have the inner strength, the inner will to excel, to do good, to not to violate the law, to be the best that you can be in whatever your talents and abilities will permit. Then you can become a person who can influence the quality of life of all citizens of this country. Indeed, even on the bench, I was persuaded by Marian Wright Ellerman of the Children Defense Fund to become her first judge in residence to deal with liaison with the U.S. Congress and to deal with improving the quality of the welfare system, dealing with neglect and abuse and foster care children and adoption issues, and served as the co-chair and liaison with the senators and with the House of Representative members who dealt with children issues, even while still serving as a senior judge on the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. And then finally, I was approached by a gentleman who was becoming president of the National Bar Association, the Black Bar Association, because back when the American Bar Association was created, Negroes could not belong. Indeed, when I went to the first American Bar Association meeting in 1961 in Atlanta, Georgia, to a mid-year meeting of the American Bar Association, when I got back, my wife asked me how many other Negroes, colored people, did I see? And I scratched my head and said, I hadn't thought about it, but I think the only one I saw was myself shaving in the mirror. There weren't that many Negroes. I was one of the first Negroes of color to become actively involved in the American Bar Association. Oh, let me just go back on one major development. While serving as legal advisor to the Civil Service Commission from 1975 to 80, Congress considered expanding the Magistrates Act, and I was chair of the Federal Bar Committee. And I testified before the Congressional Committee, the Senate Committee, Senator Kennedy, Senator Strom Thurmond, and I followed Griffith Bell, who was the Attorney General, who agreed to Justice Department to allow magistrates to try civil cases with consent of the parties. But then, if the parties didn't like the outcome of the case before a magistrate, in connection with becoming magistrate judges, that they could have a de novo trial before a U.S. District Court judge. I argued to the Senate Judiciary Committee, number one, that magistrates are picked by judges like they pick their law clerks, the most intellectual talent they can find, the best people they can find. Therefore, when the lawyers consent to a magistrate trying a case, the magistrate wants to encourage lawyers to use magistrates, that they're not arbitrary and capricious, that they are reasonable people, that they will try to do justice and equality in dealing with all the parties with an even hand, with total objectivity, and not with bias and prejudice, which we deal with today, not with implicit bias. And lo and behold, Senator Thurmond said, that makes good sense to me, Mr. Burnett. Kennedy said, I agree. And the Congress adopted my views over that of Griffin Bell. And magistrates became substitute district judges in trying civil cases with direct appeal to the Court of Appeals to reduce the financial burden on parties in connection with litigation. Indeed, in 1985, in the U.S. District Court here in Washington, D.C., I sat as a substitute district judge and tried in one 12-month period 13 civil cases, in addition to all the other magistrate duties. So I want American youth, number one, to realize that you don't have to be born rich or even in middle class. But if you have the drive and you have the willpower, you have the talent and you have the brains, you can achieve. You can have great accomplishments in life rather than end up being prison inmates because you are rebelling, because you are engaged in looting and wrongdoing rather than in self-improvement. That's the message I want our youth to understand. That's the message I want our adults to communicate to our youth of this nation, so that there is no supremacy of any particular group. We are all equal. We are all human beings and should be judged for who we are based on the content of our character, based on our abilities and what we can accomplish, what we can do. And indeed, in the 20th century and the 21st century, with the move to technology and science and electronics, it is more paramount today that we tap the talents and abilities of every human being. And every human being is evaluated as an individual, not based on his complexion of his skin or his national origin or sex or sexual orientation or religious affiliation, but as an individual human being. In thinking about this presentation, I looked at a number of religious scripture, and I recall several, but the one that sticks out in mind is where Jesus is telling a group of people who are about to stone a woman for being a sex prostitute, any above you who are sins, throw the first stone. And the crowd began to melt away. They began to move, and the woman kind of stood out. I hoped and prayed that she began to mend her ways. So we all have to think about, maybe we're here and there we've slipped at time to time. We have to mend our ways. But then God says there's redemption. There's a way to overcome your sins. Indeed, Saul became Paul. Saul the murderer, exonerated, became one of the leading disciples of Christ. So we must, in this country today, face most of the critical times of division, divisiveness, and open hostility on the basis of race, and we begin to recognize individuals as individual people, as individuals of all of equal worth. I recall, I won't mention the name, but a leading government official said to me when I was being considered to be the general counsel of the EEOC, well, Judge Burnett, or Mr. Burnett at that time, I was still legal counsel for the Civil Service Commission, how would you administer affirmative action with the civil service merits? And I say to the official, I cannot be a reverse segregationist. If I have two candidates before me, one white, one black, then I may choose the black, but I cannot be a reverse discriminator, choose a black who's less qualified than the white person. I have to look at the individual and say which person has the best qualifications for this particular job. I did not get the job. I came in second fiddle because maybe I was too straight, too much a person who would not bend the rules, who would not bend justice, but who would tell it like it is. And then I recall, and I've had hundreds of law interns But one lawyer in turn said to me one day, Judge Burnett, how do you want to decide this case? And I looked him straight in the eye. What do you mean how I want? Well, what kind of outcome do you want to achieve? And I said to him, I want to achieve justice. I want to do what's right. I want to come up with a decision that if we went to the U.S. Supreme Court, at least I'll have 5 justices agreeing with me. They don't always see it the same way. But my guiding standard is, what does the Constitution and the law require? Not my personal views, not my political views, but whether or not I think I can get 5 justices to say, Judge Burnett is affirmed. Indeed, on the Superior Court, I was considered the professor judge. And many judges would call me, interfere with me getting home to my wife for dinner, on how they should decide a motion to suppress a confession, as to whether to believe this, that, or the other, as to how the confession came about, or in a search and seizure case. And I would tell them, you have to decide credibility. Who are you going to believe? Who is stretching the truth? Who is what really happened? And make the best decision you can. That's all I can tell you. Make a decision which is consistent with the law, that is not biased, not prejudiced. Doesn't make a difference whether the defendant is black, white, Jew, blue, or whatever color. Treat everyone equal. That is your task. And as a professor judge, that's what I used to tell my comrades sometimes at 6 or 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the evening, when some of them also stayed late after o'clock and didn't rush home right at 5 o'clock. Indeed, most people don't realize, but most people who aspire to become judges, are people who are workaholics, people who are committed to doing justice, to being honorable, to doing a thorough and good job, to being sustained in their rulings, to doing equality and justice without the complexion of the skin, or the color of the person, or the circumstances. And so, in concluding, we now, as we enter the 20th century and move towards the 21st century, we must overcome the divisiveness, the openness of racial hostility and racial hostility in America. We must have people like myself and others talking to mixed audiences, saying that no one race of people, no national origin is supreme. We are all equals. We are all here for justice. And that leads me to perhaps a most controversial recommendation once we get beyond the coming presidential election. And that is whether we, in the 20th and 21st century, must come to the reality that we no longer live in the 1700s and the 1800s. And perhaps we should have a second constitutional convention. People are afraid of the idea of a second constitutional convention because they figure people will go haywire and we're all over the place. But let's try to get some reasonable people together and say, what kind of society do we need? What type of society must we have going forward in the future? One of the biggest problems, of course, is the Second Amendment. And in this case, I happen to disagree with Justice Scalia in the Heller case about citizens being armed, because back in the 1770, 75 to 80, we were living in the pioneer era. And many people living on plantations, in other words, lived by hunting. But we were also concerned about a renewal of the revolution and the militia. And I have read the original Posh documents dealing with the Second Amendment and what the principal concerns were. Number one, we don't want to deprive people of their guns because they need their guns to go out into the wilderness to kill animals, to live our pioneers on the frontier. We need them for the military, for the militia, in case there's a revolution. We need them to fight Indian bands in case there was also conflicts at the time between Indian tribes and our white pioneers moving into Indian territory areas. Let's ask ourselves whether in the urban society we live in today, like here in the District of Columbia where one person gets killed and 20 people get shot at the beginning of this week in Southeast Washington. What about gun shootings in Washington, D.C.? What about gun shootings in Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles? We do the statistics. We kill people, more people in urban America than we've killed in World War II. In the time that we think and rethink the Second Amendment and the Heller decision, we require in this country that people who drive cars can't have bad eyesight, they can't drive them blind, they can't be mentally deficient, they have to be able to operate them safely. Why can't we require men and women to be certified to operate guns safely? So I proposed to President Obama, proposed legislation which would say that any private citizen who would want a gun must be subject to a psychiatric examination to make sure the person doesn't suffer depression, anxiety syndrome, where the person overreacts and handling a gun may be inappropriate, might be dangerous. And if a psychiatrist says, this person's got a history of domestic violence, he's been subject to stay away orders, we don't certify him as being, or her, as being eligible to have a gun. If the person disagrees, have a review panel of 3 psychiatrists. And if 2 out of 3 say, then you don't get a gun. Much like in driving, when you get to be a senior citizen, they don't allow you to continue to drive if your sight doesn't allow it, or your hearing is not sufficient. Do we need to rewrite the Second Amendment? Do we need to rewrite the 13th Amendment and eliminate involuntary servitude and slavery in prison, where as a result, we throw the kids of the people in prison on welfare and take care of them without any parental supervision or caretaking? Or should we, like Germany, turn our prisons into community colleges, trade centers, technology schools, so that when people get out of prison, instead of returning to recidivism and committing new crimes, they can be worthwhile to society. They can be employed. They can be skilled. Indeed, some people who come out of prison, who develop the talents and abilities, sometimes turn out to become leaders of our community, doing more for our communities by way of neighborhood watch, by way of safety and protection and working with our youth, than people who have never strayed. You will never know. I recall attending a meeting with Jesse Jackson at one time, and at lunch break we were taken to task by the press saying, well, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Burnett, the only problem, this is a wonderful session you're having, but you don't have any inmates here. And Jesse looked at me and smiled. He said, Arthur, will you tell them? And I said, would everybody here in the room stand up who've been in prison? 19 individuals stood up, dressed like I am today in a suit and a tie. One was a franchise vehicle trader. Another was a deputy administrator of our correctional system who, as a youth, had been convicted of youth for being an aider and abettor in a robbery. Finally, his conviction was set aside, who now was the number 2 person over the correctional system for the entire District of Columbia. Many become worthwhile ministers working 16, 18 hours a day, trying to keep kids from making the mistakes they made. So the question is, should our prisons merely be warehouses? Or should our prisons prepare people for jobs that will exist when they get out of prison? Technology schools, trade schools, plumbers, electricians, painters, electronic experts. Indeed, I recall going to Lawton and talking to a group of inmates. And there was a young guy who was in his 11th year of serving a sentence for manslaughter. And he said to me, Judge, if I had had a father like you are, instead of sitting here in prison, I perhaps could have been the vice president of a major corporation now. Because since I've been here in prison, I've earned full college degrees. It shows what lack of guidance and nourishment and support for our youth lead many to situations where they end up being prison inmates who could have been great talents and great contributors to our society. So looking forward, going forward, Martin had a dream, but I want to go further. I have a vision. I have a vision where no group of people are supreme. White supremacy, black supremacy, men's simplicity, women's supremacy, where nobody is supreme. Everybody stands on equal footing in the eyes of Jesus Christ. And as we are taught in the New Testament about Jesus' work, the Good Samaritan reach back, treat the injured, the victim, provide for them, overcome their illness, their devastation, make them worthwhile and contributing citizens of our society. The Good Samaritan not only paid the innkeeper up front, but said, on my way back, I will pay you for whatever additional expenses you have. And then when we stand before the Lord, we are told, which side of the Lord will stand? Did you visit people in jail? Did you give water to the thirsty? Did you feed the hungry? We must be doers and not talkers. We must do things to help those less endowed and less empowered, less favored than we are, to bring together a vision of a new America where our representatives represent people. We get rid of gerrymandering. We get rid of electoral college. And a person who becomes president, a person who becomes senator, a person who becomes a member of the representative is a representative of all the people, not just a clique, not just the wealthy, not just the middle class, not just a component, but treated every person with true equality, true justice. We say in the Lord's Prayer, let it be done here on earth as it is in heaven. We have a long way to go, and I invite you to join me in this journey. I'm 85 years of age now, and I've been a member of the bar as a lawyer since October of 1954. Some people say I have an obsession, but I have a drive to change this world, to bring about true equality and civil rights, constitutional rights, where every individual is treated as the Lord, how Jesus Christ would want us to treat every human being. I hope you take my message to heart and live it, and that in our protest demonstrations, they are controlled. They are meritorious in their complaints, but not destructive, not looted and crime where we may be harming our own black businessmen who are in business when we break their windows of their stores or their laundromats or their delicatessens or their restaurants. When we loot them and they have problems even getting insurance. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot? When we had what we saw in Chicago, what we see even here in Washington, D.C., and what we see in our other cities of this nation. I thank you.